So I do want to talk to you about where we are today, but want to sort of go over the history of this war waged on Palestine, on Palestinians, and so we have some context in which to view what's happening today.
Right.
You start in 1917. Zionism is been around at that point for almost 20 some odd years, and it is not necessarily focused on a so-called return to Israel for Jews at that point, although it certainly comes up. Why 1917? And just give us a sense of, like, how these moments, and there's 6 of them that you point to, sort of create a new phase of this war.
Right. The reason I deliberately chose 1917, because what I wanted to do was to get us away from this essentially false narrative of two peoples struggling with one another. I mean, there are two peoples. The point is, it never was just between Palestinians and Israelis, or between the Palestinian national movement and the Zionist movement. It was and is a war in which the big battalions actually were not coming from either the Palestinians or the Zionists. They were coming from the British Empire, and they've come from the United States. This is not a war in which Israel has, or before that, the Zionists in Palestine were fighting all by their lonesome. They were not able to do anything that they did in the first 20 years after the Balfour Declaration without the British Empire, without the British Army, without what Zev Jabotinsky called an iron wall, provided in this case by the British. So I'm trying to show that this is a war which has always involved external actors, the most powerful external actors on the globe at every phase. I mean, the British Empire before World War II was the greatest empire in history up to that point, and the United States is the great power of the post-World War II era. And it has always been on Israel's side. I mean, we see this during the war on Gaza, but we've seen it in every previous war going back to 67, and including going back to 1948 for that matter. So I was trying through the framing, starting it with 1917, to show this is when the conflict takes on the characteristics that it's had ever since. Yes, there was Zionism before that. The first Zionist Congress was 1897. Yes, there were the beginnings of Palestinian nationalism before this, but the conflict takes on the configuration that it has had ever since with the Balfour Declaration, with the entry of the British into Palestine, and has always had that characteristic since. We're not seeing a war of the Israeli army alone on Gaza. Every shell fired by Israeli Merkava tanks is a 120 millimeter artillery shell that the United States is providing. Every 155 millimeter artillery shell is provided by the United States. Every Hellfire missile, every warplane in the Israeli arsenal is an American warplane. Every helicopter, Apache helicopter, is an American helicopter. The United States is providing these things, in my view, in violation of U.S. law. They have to be used for defensive purposes. They can't be used in ways that contravene international humanitarian law or human rights. And so this blank check is, in effect, makes this an American-Israeli war. This is Biden's war, not just Netanyahu's war. And it was Britain's war on the Palestinians. When they crushed the great revolt of 1936-39, they brought 100,000 troops into Palestine. There were only a few 100,000 Palestinians at the time. There was one soldier for like every 8 people. That's not a war of the poor little Jewish community in Palestine on the Palestinians. That's a war of the greatest empire up to that day against the Palestinians. And that's why I frame it in that way, starting in 1917.
Can you walk us through that? Because I think, like, one of the things that over the years I have come to understand, having had a Jewish education that was very sort of like Holocaust, Israel centric, maybe even beyond, like even from a cultural or Hebrew or religious education, was a sense that there was nobody there, and that this was empty territory. But the existence of a revolt and a rebellion, and the British bringing in military personnel to quiet that suggests, well, that's not the case. Obviously, Will you walk us through that era? Because this is an era too where we're just starting to see an increase in Jewish immigration there. When you're in the tens and even in the 20s, the percentage of Jews in Palestine is still single to double digits, early double digits, maybe in the teens at one point.
Right. Until 1932, I don't think the Jewish population as a proportion of the whole went above 20%. It was 17, 18%. It balloons because of the rise to power of the Nazis in 1933. By 1939, you have 31 or 32% of the population are Jewish. So up until the rise to power of the Nazis, the Jewish population in Palestine was well under 20%. In fact, in 1917, when Balfour issues the declaration, it's 5% maybe of the whole. So you bring up an important point, which is this pretense that this is a land without a people for a people without a land. Well, actually, this is not a land without a people. And even Balfour himself recognizes this. He says in a memo that I quote in the book, we just don't consider these people's rights as important as the rights of the people to whom we're promising a homeland. They're not as important, in other words, as the Jewish people. So the Brits knew that the Arabs were there, this overwhelming majority. And early Zionists did. I mean, Ahad Ha'am was writing these letters from Palestine saying, you're pretending there's nobody here. There are people here. And they're not gonna put up with this. But people preferred to ignore that. And that stays up until the present, I would argue.
And I would agree. And I think just in terms of like the Balfour Declaration, we should, contextualize that briefly for us, because my understanding is that declaration was both a function of, well, it was primarily a function of a British Empire outpost, essentially, in that region, to hold off maybe France's power that was in Algiers, et cetera. Just walk us through that. And then, right, there is some element of Balfour's anti-Semitism. It was sort of a twofer for him.
Right. I mean, there's several elements to the Balfour Declaration. The most important one is the one you mentioned, which is that Britain wanted Palestine for strategic reasons long before, Chaim Weizmann sold the idea to the British cabinet during World War I. Back in 1906, 1907, they realized they needed to control Palestine, partly to keep other powers out, as you suggest, but mainly as a buffer for the defense of the eastern frontier of Egypt. And that was the strategic reason. And then they later on realized we need to control the Mediterranean terminus of the shortest route between the Mediterranean and the Gulf. And that's Haifa. That's Palestine. So for essentially strategic reasons, Britain wanted Palestine long before they agreed to issue the Balfour Declaration, long before they saw the Zionist movement as a potential ally in this project. Now, there's other elements, of course. There's what you could call British philo-Semitism or Christian Zionism, which actually antedates Jewish Zionism. You have British aristocrats back in the 1830s, 40s, 50s saying, it's a Christian duty to reestablish the Jewish people in the land of Israel. Very important British political figures are talking about this long before modern political Zionism. And then you have anti-Semitism. So Balfour himself, before he became foreign secretary, had been prime minister at a time of some of the most intense persecution of Jews in the Russian Empire. The Kishinev pogrom and many other pogroms were taking place in Russia after the 1905 revolution, and people were fleeing by the thousands these horrible pogroms and this terrible persecution, and trying to come to England. And so Balfour's government actually passes something called the Alien Exclusion Act to keep persecuted Jews out of England, motivated essentially by anti-Semitism. And so you have the irony of a British politician who authored probably the most anti-Semitic act in English history since, King Edward kicked all the Jews out of England in 1290, being the author of the Balfour Declaration, promising the Jewish people a homeland, promising to support a homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine. It's one of many ironies in this story.
Right. And another irony to me is how Zionism took on so many of the characteristics of the very nationalism that led to the persecution of Jews in Europe. This European form of nationalism. Can you speak to how modern Zionism and political Zionism in the context of Israel takes that very shape of nationalism that, ended up resulting in World War II, for example?
Right. Well, I think you have to look at the people who are the first proponents of Zionism. They're almost all Eastern European. That is to say, they're people who grew up either in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, people like Herzl himself, who came from Budapest and lived in Vienna, or came from what was then called the Pale of Settlement, an area that is now in Ukraine, around today's Kyiv. 34, I think, of the signatories of the Israeli Declaration of Independence come from within 200 miles. They originated from towns and villages and shtetls within 200 miles of Kyiv. So this is an Eastern European nationalist project. It grew up in conversation with Eastern European nationalism. You're absolutely right, Emma. And it has all the characteristics of Eastern European nationalism. Ethnic, a certain focus on ethnicity, blood and soil, and so on and so forth. And that's Zionism is in its as a political ideology is essentially one of several nationalisms that grows up in Eastern Europe among Eastern European Jews who are particularly persecuted and who see as their only refuge to escape European anti-Semitism and go elsewhere. It didn't always have to be Palestine. There were some who talked about East Africa. There were some who talked about Argentina, but the majority ended up deciding that it had to be. And there were some who talked about Sinai, but they ended up deciding it had to be Palestine, the land of Israel, partly for the biblical, because of the biblical connection, obviously.
And all right, so let's we're at the end of World War II, and what was the dynamic that led things like the Haganah and the Irgun and the Stern Gang? I mean, I don't know how much people are aware, like Menachem Begin, who will later play a very big role, I think, in where Israel is today, in terms of like specific, almost a unique one in terms of like the turning of maybe analogous to Reagan, although I think in a more severe way during that era.
There's a good comparison there. Yeah.
But he is responsible or leading, I think it was the Irgun at that time, for blowing up the King David Hotel, killing, I think it was 90 some odd people. It was arguably partially a military target, although I guess the British would, arguably, certainly there were a lot of non-military personnel were killed in this, it was being blown up because they didn't want information that the British had found from what other Zionists were doing within Palestine to be known. But explain that dynamic that's going on there. Where there were terrorist groups, Stern Gang, I think, unequivocally seems to me to be a terrorist group, that were advocating for, they were pushing Britain to like basically pull the trigger and provide the sort of like a Palestinian mandate. What was the dynamic there?
The dynamic there, I think you have to go back a little bit to understand that after wholeheartedly supporting Zionism right through the 20s and the 30s and crushing this massive Palestinian revolt from 1936 to 39, 14 to 17% of adult male Palestinians were killed, wounded, imprisoned, or exiled by the British, who brought in, as I said, 100,000 troops to crush this revolt. Having done that, they realized that they were on the brink of World War II, the British, and they had to fight World War II against Italy and Germany in the Middle East, in a situation where colonial peoples all over the world supported the Palestinians and loathed the British for what they had done to them. And so you had British officials in Egypt and in India saying, we have to change our policy. We cannot continue to support unlimited immigration and blanket support for the Zionists and suppression of the Palestinians, because we're going to have to fight in Egypt. We're going to have to fight in Iraq. We need the Indian army. They were not able to send Indian troops to Palestine to crush the revolt in the late 30s because they weren't sure of their loyalty. They were afraid they would side with the Palestinians. So Britain changes its policy. It shuts down immigration. It promises independence to what would have then been a majority Arab Palestine within 10 years. And which the shutting down of immigration, mind you, is coming at the height of the persecution of Jews in Europe. And Palestine, given racist immigration laws in the United States, the racist immigration laws in England, Palestine was the only place people could go to who were able to escape Europe. So the British shut that down, infuriating, obviously, the Zionists. And they turn against the British at that point. And that's where the Irgun and the Stern gang start assassinating British officials, killing British soldiers, blowing up British trains, and ultimately blowing up, as you said, the King David Hotel, which was the British headquarters, but where many dozens of people, innocent people, were killed in addition to British officials. So that's what explains the shift of the Zionists against the British. The British said basically in 1939, we've done what we promised. We've created a Jewish national home. Now we've got to fight World War II, and we need the support of the Arabs, or at least we can't continue to alienate them. And so they make a shift in 1939 with what's called a white paper of 1939. And the Zionist movement never forgives them. And so you have this intense war against Britain, especially after World War II ends, which is intended to force the British out of Palestine. In the meantime, the Zionist movement has found new patrons in Washington and in Moscow. And these are the powers that help to push through the partition resolution, which gives most of Palestine to a Jewish minority as a Jewish state.
And I just want to just go back one more. The revolt of 36. What precipitated that, and give us a sense of what kind of communities existed in Palestine at that time.
Right. Well, I mean, I think the casualty toll tells you that people were pretty committed to fighting the British, pretty committed to the idea that this is our country, we should control it. We were promised in the Covenant of League of Nations that we were a provisionally independent country, and we never got that. Instead, the British helped to establish a completely different national movement and gave it exclusive rights in Palestine. So the Palestinians were revolting against the British and against Zionism. And you had a pretty cohesive Palestinian national movement, divided with different political trends. But the casualty toll alone tells you how committed people were to fighting the British. When you have that number of people killed, wounded, imprisoned, and I mean, my uncle was sent off to the Seychelles. He was exiled. The whole leadership was thrown in jail, and often exiled to places like the Seychelles and Kenya and so on. Others were just shot on sight or hanged. Other leaders. So the British had crushed what was really a national revolt by the Palestinians against their rule and against the mandate, which essentially gave the British the right from the League of Nations to run Palestine for the benefit of the Zionist project. That's what the Palestinians were revolting against.
I think what's so important too about that moment in history is it really illustrates that this is a nationalist movement that is not a function of anti-Semitism. They had a problem with the British.
And they had, Sam, if I can interrupt you, and they had a problem with the settlers. But the point is, if the settlers had been Danes or Martians, right, they would have opposed them. Right. I mean, the idea is somebody else is coming in here and getting national rights at our expense and planning to take over our country. If they'd been blue, green, white, red, Christian, Buddhist, whatever, they would have opposed them. And there would have been nothing anti-Christian in opposing a Danish settler project backed by the British.
Right. And I think that point has been obscured both, deliberately and perhaps inadvertently, or but with a specific, as a way of making this some type of like timeless conflict that was is not tied to national
religious war.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. It's not a religious war. It's become more religious over time. But it's essentially a conflict against what Palestinians perceive as a settler colonial project backed by external powers. And whoever the settlers were, I mean, in this case, they have a religious connection and there's a religious element to Zionism, of course. But that's not what is important to the Palestinians. What's important to the Palestinians, they came to create a Jewish state in an Arab majority country and transform what Jabotinsky described in one of his articles, to transform Palestine into the land of Israel. And that's what Jabotinsky's successors, starting with Menachem Begin in 1977, have tried to do. So Begin, Shamir, Ariel Sharon, Netanyahu, they're all in the line of thought of Jabotinsky and his followers, arguing you have to take this country over by force. The native population will resist. This is a colonial project. All of these things are things that Jabotinsky says, and that people like Begin and Shamir, to their credit, believe. They don't pretend, as labor Zionists used to, oh no, we intend to help the local population. We never intended to harm them. Jabotinsky and his followers are much more blunt about this.
There are two elements that seem to converge when we get to Begin, and that era is 20 some odd years from where we're at this moment. But when Israel the mandate happens, the UN mandate happens, Israel gets about 80% of the land, and we should say in the lead up to this, there are basically, I don't know how else to describe it, ethnic cleansings of both massacres like Deir Yassin, but there's bombing, there's ethnic cleansing that drives a lot of people into Gaza, for that matter, at that time, in addition to to the West Bank.